March 23, 1945, Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower faced a logistical anomaly that defied the very laws of modern warfare as he understood them. This was the day that General George S. Patton, the most volatile and brilliant commander in the Allied arsenal, chose to rewrite history without asking for permission, shattering German defenses and capturing an entire army in a single, relentless night of combat. The morning rain of early spring tapped rhythmically against the windows of a requisitioned champagne warehouse in Reims, France, where the supreme headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force hummed with the mechanical efficiency of a continent-sized war machine. General Dwight D. Eisenhower sat at his mahogany desk, surrounded by maps that bled with the red and blue lines of shifting fronts and dotted supply routes stretching back to the hallowed beaches of Normandy. He was a man consumed by the granular reality of liberation, currently mired in the exhausting paperwork of fuel allocations for the First Army and artillery ammunition for the Ninth Army. The door to his inner sanctum opened to reveal his Chief of Staff, General Walter Bedell Smith, whose face remained a mask of professional neutrality as he carried a single sheet of paper that would soon shatter the quiet atmosphere of the command center. It was a prisoner of war status report from the Third Army, and as Eisenhower glanced at the figures, his hand froze mid-signature on a fuel requisition form. The Supreme Commander blinked and read the number again, his expression going completely blank as his brain struggled to process information that seemed to defy the limits of physical possibility. He asked quietly if the report truly stated 50,000, and Smith confirmed that the Third Army had indeed processed 50,000 prisoners in a mere 18 hours. Eisenhower demanded a second verification, but Smith had already checked the figures twice, revealing that the 12th Corps reported 28,000, while the 20th Corps accounted for another 22,000. The final count stood at 50,000, 127 enemy prisoners of war captured between 1,800 hours on March 22nd and 1,200 hours on March 23rd. Eisenhower set down his pen and pulled over the intelligence summary from the 21st Army Group, which was under the command of Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery in the north. The contrast was staggering because Montgomery had spent 4 weeks of methodical operations to capture 47,000 prisoners with 8 divisions, yet Patton had exceeded that total in less than a day with only 6 divisions. When Eisenhower inquired about the Third Army's prisoner of war cages, Smith revealed a crisis of success. They had 17 operational, but were requesting 12 more on emergency priority because they had completely run out of barbed wire. To contain 50,000 men, according to the standards of the Geneva Convention, Patton's forces required approximately 90 miles of barbed wire fencing, and they had exhausted the entire theater allocation before the first light of dawn. Eisenhower stood and walked to the situation map, his finger tracing the lines of the Palatinate Pocket, a triangle of German-held territory nestled between the Rhine, the Moselle, and the Siegfried Line. Intelligence estimates had suggested that 14 battered German divisions were dug in within that pocket, and SHAEF planning had projected it would take 2 weeks of methodical advances and coordinated artillery to clear the area. Patton had cleared it in 3 days. The Supreme Commander realized with a mixture of awe and frustration that his most aggressive general had just rewritten the rulebook on mobile warfare, and he demanded that the Third Army headquarters be put on the line immediately. The phone line from Reims to the forward headquarters in Nieder-Oberstein crackled with static as Eisenhower picked up the receiver, his voice remaining calm and controlled despite the monumental news. He asked George S. Patton to explain how he had taken 50,000 men without requesting additional processing units or coordinating with Army Group logistics. Patton's voice came through the receiver with an unapologetic confidence, stating simply that the Germans kept surrendering, and he could not very well tell them to come back the next day when the paperwork cleared. He explained that the 12th Corps had broken through at Kaiserslautern, while the 20th Corps hit from the south, causing a collapse so rapid that entire regiments surrendered without firing a single shot. The situation had become so absurd that some German units were marching themselves to the rear because the Third Army did not have enough military police to escort them. Eisenhower closed his eyes and could clearly picture the scene of Patton's armor punching through weak points while the infantry followed up to mop up the exhausted and surrounded German units. The Third Army steamroller was doing what it did best, moving with such blistering speed that the enemy could not even formulate a reaction. Eisenhower noted that Montgomery had spent a full month preparing for Operation Plunder, with massive artillery support and airborne drops to take the Rhine by the book. Patton interrupted to inform the Supreme Commander that he had already crossed the Rhine the previous night without losing a single man, and the report would be on Eisenhower's desk by morning. A total and heavy silence fell over the room in Reims as staff officers froze and General Bedell Smith stopped mid-step, everyone staring at Eisenhower as he processed the fact that Patton had conducted an unauthorized crossing. Eisenhower asked in a very quiet voice when Patton had planned to tell him, and Patton responded that he was telling him now. The 11th Armored Division had used assault boats south of Mainz at 2230 hours, finding barely any opposition and pushing 6 miles deep into German territory within hours. The Third Army was already within reach of Frankfurt, but Eisenhower's hand tightened on the receiver as he reminded Patton that Schaeff had allocated all resources for Montgomery's crossing, which Churchill himself was scheduled to observe as the official Allied Rhine crossing. Patton countered that every hour of waiting was an hour the Germans used to regroup, and since he had the bridgehead at Oppenheim, the boats, and the momentum, he took the shot to save lives. Eisenhower knew there was an undeniable logic in Patton's recklessness and insubordination, because the man was right more often than he was wrong, and when he was right, he was devastatingly effective. He told Patton they would discuss the matter later, and warned him to try not to capture the entire Wehrmacht without telling anyone before the line went dead. Eisenhower looked at Smith and ordered him to notify the Army Group commanders that the Third Army had crossed the Rhine successfully and without casualties, though he noted with a grimace that Montgomery would not love the news. Back at the Third Army headquarters, Patton turned to his staff with a grin and told them the Supreme Commander wanted them to slow down, then immediately asked if they were actually going to slow down. He walked to the map and tapped a spot on the main river 30 miles beyond their current positions, ordering the 4th Armored Division to lead the way so they could take Frankfurt by the following afternoon. By March 24th, the sheer volume of prisoners had completely overwhelmed the European theater power system, with 63,000 men being held in facilities designed for only 15,000. Military police battalions worked around the clock to build makeshift compounds using captured German materials, including barbed wire from pillboxes and wooden posts from roadblocks. They even repurposed the concrete dragon's teeth of the Siegfried Line as fence posts to contain the masses of surrendering soldiers. The situation was so chaotic that German officers began organizing their own men because there were not enough American guards, and prisoners formed their own work details to cook food and post sentries against escapes. It was a state of functional but barely contained chaos that prompted the International Red Cross to send a cable to Schaeff, warning that Third Army facilities exceeded capacity by 400% and required immediate action. General John Lee, the logistics commander, arrived at Eisenhower's office with a stack of reports and a look of barely controlled frustration. Lee spread charts across the desk showing that the Third Army had consumed 110% of its allocated fuel for March and had exceeded ammunition allotments by 40%. They were even requisitioning rations from the First Army depots without authorization and were using captured German trucks to transport their own supplies. Eisenhower studied the red ink covering the charts and asked simply if Patton's advance was working and achieving its objectives. Lee hesitated before admitting that Patton was advancing so fast that supply trucks could not keep up, so the general was capturing German supply depots and running his entire army off enemy logistics. Just the day before, the 20th Corps had captured a fuel dump near Darmstadt and distributed it to tank battalions immediately without reporting it through proper channels. When Eisenhower pressed again to know if it was working, Lee looked at his charts and replied that it was working perfectly, which somehow made the situation worse for a logistics officer. Preliminary estimates suggested that Patton's initiative had saved 2.1 million gallons of fuel over 2 weeks and 3 weeks of transportation capacity by making the enemy supply its own defeat. Eisenhower decided to let him keep doing it, but ordered that someone document the process in case they ever had to repeat such a feat in the future. However, the Supreme Commander's problems were only beginning because on March 26th, Patton simply stopped answering his phone. Meanwhile, at the 21st Army Group headquarters in the Netherlands, Field Marshal Montgomery was reading the morning intelligence summary in his caravan. Operation Plunder was scheduled to launch that night as the official Allied crossing of the Rhine, involving 80,000 troops, 3,500 artillery pieces, and 2 airborne divisions. It was designed to be a methodical and overwhelming application of force in the traditional British way of war, with Winston Churchill himself watching from an observation post. When Montgomery's intelligence officer handed him the report showing Patton had already crossed the Rhine in assault boats without any preliminary bombardment, the Field Marshal's eyes tightened with a masterfully controlled irritation. He immediately wrote a message to Schaeff requesting confirmation that Third Army operations would not interfere with the Operation Plunder timeline. Montgomery's chief of staff understood the subtext of the message immediately, which was essentially a plea to tell Patton to stop showing them up. Eisenhower sighed as he read the message, reflecting on the hidden burden of supreme command that involved managing massive egos and balancing the personalities of brilliant but difficult men. He drafted a response to assure Montgomery that Operation Plunder remained the main effort and that the Third Army's crossing was merely a supporting operation, even though Patton was already deeper into Germany. He knew that Montgomery needed to feel that his operation mattered, but he also recognized that the Allies needed crossings all along the Rhine, not just Patton's mad dash in the south. As Eisenhower looked at the map, he saw the Allied advance working in a way no one had intended, with Patton approaching Frankfurt while Montgomery prepared to cross and the First Army consolidated at Remagen. On March 26, Winston Churchill arrived at Montgomery's headquarters with photographers and war correspondents to observe what was supposed to be the British Empire's triumphant crossing of the last major barrier to Berlin. After being briefed on the massive scale of the set-piece operation, someone mentioned that Patton had already crossed the river 2 days earlier using simple assault boats. Churchill's expression remained unreadable as he turned to Montgomery and asked if it was true that Patton had conducted an unauthorized crossing south of Mainz. Montgomery confirmed that Patton had not coordinated with Schaeff or neighboring armies before executing his plan. Churchill looked at the map showing Patton's forces had already advanced 45 miles beyond the Rhine. Then, in a move that surprised the gathered officers, Churchill broke into a big, genuine smile and remarked that the Americans had stolen a march on them, calling Patton very enterprising. He suggested to Montgomery that they ensure Operation Plunder was executed with such success that no one would remember who crossed first, acknowledging that while the Americans crossed in boats, the British would cross with the entire weight of the empire. Churchill understood, as Eisenhower did, that this was not a competition, but a war that the Allies were finally winning. Yet Montgomery still sent another message to Schaeff, questioning if the Third Army's advance was moving too fast for proper coordination. Eisenhower handed the message to Bedell Smith and asked for a diplomatic way to say, "Let Patton run." By the 27th of March, 1945, the situation map at Schaeff was becoming a source of professional embarrassment for the staff officers tasked with updating it. A young lieutenant reported to the duty officer that he could not confirm the positions of the Third Army because the 4th Armored Division was reported at Frankfurt when they had been 30 miles west only a day before. Such a move was considered impossible in 24 hours while facing enemy opposition. Yet the radio logs and position reports confirmed the movement. The 12th Corps was already at Wiesbaden, and the 20th Corps had taken Darmstadt, meaning the Third Army was advancing faster than the pins could be moved across the map. The duty officer ordered the markers updated with a note that these were estimated positions, as they would likely change again before the next report arrived. The Schaeff staff increased the frequency of updates from every 6 hours to every 2 hours, but they still could not keep pace with Patton's units. German resistance was not being defeated in traditional battles, but was simply collapsing because American tanks were appearing behind German lines before orders to establish a defense could even be issued. On March 28th, Montgomery's own liaison officer reported that Patton's forces were 13 days ahead of schedule. Montgomery said nothing and returned to his planning, determined that his own operations would at least be executed flawlessly. At his own headquarters, Patton received the latest prisoner count from Colonel Oscar Koch, 91,000 prisoners captured since March 22nd. The Third Army had captured more prisoners in 6 days, and Patton, grinning, told Koch to send a message to General Bradley. The message was blunt. If Bradley could get him enough gasoline, Patton would have the Third Army in Berlin in 48 hours. When Koch asked if they should clear the message with Schaeff first, Patton simply ordered him to send it. General Omar Bradley, Patton's immediate superior, received the message and shook his head, calling Eisenhower to admit he had given up trying to control George. He noted that Patton was achieving objectives that had not even been assigned for another 2 weeks, and Eisenhower told him to let Patton run while keeping a close track of his methods. Bradley ordered his staff to give the Third Army priority on fuel shipments and to draft detailed after-action reports because he knew no one would believe the statistics after the war. On the German side, the view was one of utter alarm as General Hermann Balk, a veteran of the Eastern Front, tried to establish a defensive line along the main river. He issued orders to 3 divisions to hold the river crossings, to buy time for Army Group B to withdraw. But by the time the orders reached the forward units, American tanks were already across the river. The defensive line Balk envisioned never actually existed in reality. After the war, Balk would admit that the Germans could not understand Patton's speed, as their doctrine called for rest and resupply after a river crossing. But Patton simply never stopped moving. Balk compared the experience to fighting a forest fire that spread beyond every attempt at containment. Another German officer noted more simply that Patton did not fight them, he overran them. Even the Soviet liaison officer at Schaeff took notice, sending a report to Moscow that compared Patton's rates of advance to the legendary 1944 Soviet Bagration offensive. He recommended that the Red Army study American mobile warfare techniques, which was a significant admission from a military that pridefully pioneered deep battle doctrine. By March 28, the Third Army had advanced 87 miles beyond the Rhine in just 5 days, capturing 93,000 prisoners and destroying 1,400 German vehicles. Patton was now threatening to encircle the entirety of German Army Group B in the Ruhr, an operation Schaeff planning had estimated would take 6 weeks. Patton had completed the preliminary work in less than 7 days. He told his staff that every hour of maintained momentum was an hour the Germans could not regroup, and he dismissed concerns about logistics or schedules. When asked about casualties, Patton asserted that speed was armor, and that they were taking fewer losses by moving fast than they would by moving slowly. He was correct, as Third Army casualties during the March offensive were less than half of what Schaeff had projected for an operation of that scale. German units were surrendering rather than fighting because they lacked the time to organize any effective resistance. On March 29th, Eisenhower decided to see the miracle for himself and flew his personal C-47 to the recently captured airfield in Frankfurt. Patton was waiting on the runway in a fresh uniform with his trademark ivory-handled revolver on his hip. Eisenhower looked around at the smoke still visible on the horizon and asked Patton if he had any idea how many regulations he had violated in the past week. Patton snapped a salute and replied that he had been too busy winning the war to count them. They walked to Patton's command vehicle, a captured German staff car, where maps and intelligence summaries were spread across every surface. Eisenhower pointed out that Patton had exceeded his fuel, taken too many prisoners, and left his flanks exposed for 60 miles. Patton spread a larger map on the hood of the car and showed Eisenhower that they had cut off the German 7th Army and were about to close the Ruhr pocket. He estimated they would take 300,000 German soldiers out of the war, ending their ability to retreat or resupply. Eisenhower realized that Patton's speed had created an opportunity that the official planning had not anticipated for another month. When Eisenhower asked about Montgomery, Patton noted that both of their different ways were working and that between them, they were ending the war. Eisenhower looked at the exhausted but exhilarated general and remarked quietly that Patton was either going to win the war 6 months early or get them all court-martialed. Patton grinned and said he would take those odds. Eisenhower shook his head, watching a man who operated by rules that did not exist in any doctrine and who made the impossible look routine. It was then that Eisenhower uttered the words that would define Patton's legacy. He told George that he was the only man he knew who could make the impossible routine. Patton stopped grinning for a moment, recognizing the fundamental truth in Eisenhower's statement. While other commanders operated within the realm of the achievable by calculating logistics and enemy strength, Patton transcended those limits because his operational tempo existed on a different plane. He understood that momentum was its own force multiplier. The 50,000 prisoners taken in a single night were not an anomaly, but proof that Patton had weaponized speed. German units surrendered because they were disoriented and paralyzed, finding the enemy everywhere at once. Eisenhower finally understood that Patton's apparent chaos was actually a highly sophisticated form of warfare that violated principles of methodical advance to achieve in days what orthodox tactics took weeks to accomplish. Patton thanked him and immediately asked about his next gasoline allocation, to which Eisenhower laughed and told him to get back to work. The final statistics of the Palatinate Rhine campaign from March 13th to March 28th revealed that the Third Army had captured 113,000 prisoners in total. This total exceeded the 87,000 captured by the entire British 21st Army Group during the same period, despite Patton having fewer divisions. By April 1st, the Third Army was 120 miles beyond the Rhine, and the Ruhr pocket was closed on April 4th, trapping 317,000 German soldiers in the largest encirclement of the Western Theater. The contrast between Patton's crossing at Oppenheim and Montgomery's Operation Plunder was stark. Patton had 0 casualties and used 16 boats, while Montgomery's massive set piece resulted in nearly 4,000 casualties despite its success. Schaeff Logistics eventually calculated that Patton's use of captured supplies had saved the Allied chain over 2 million gallons of fuel. He had literally made the enemy supply its own defeat. Patton understood that in warfare, speed is not just a tactical advantage. It is a way to ensure the enemy command can never reorganize or coordinate reserves. The 50,000 men captured in one night were the result of a cascade effect, where German orders became outdated before they could even be executed. Patton weaponized momentum and never let it go. Eisenhower's genius lay in recognizing this sophisticated form of warfare for what it was, even as it made his staff officers nervous. In his 1948 memoir, Crusade in Europe, Eisenhower wrote that Patton demonstrated how calculated audacity could compress timelines that conventional planning deemed impossible. He famously noted that he spent half his time reining Patton in, and the other half wondering why he bothered. This captured the essence of their relationship. Patton was difficult, insubordinate, and a logistical nightmare, but he was also the man who made impossible things happen when pointed at the enemy. General George C. Marshall, the man who built the American war machine, noted in June 1945 that the Third Army's prisoner capture rate in March alone exceeded the entire U.S. Army's capture rate during the final German offensive of World War I. Marshall's handwritten notes recommended that Patton's operations become the basis for future mobile warfare doctrine, though he also jokingly recommended keeping Patton away from supply officers. By the end of the war, Patton had taken 956,000 prisoners in total, a figure unmatched by any other Allied army. He achieved this while perpetually running out of gas and operating far ahead of any official schedule. The final statistics of the Third Army were staggering: 1,300,000 miles traveled, 12,000 cities liberated, and a prisoner capture ratio of 7-to-1 for every American casualty. Military historians would later conclude that Patton's success was rooted in his understanding of the enemy's decision-making cycle. By moving faster than the enemy could observe, orient, and decide, he created a state of total paralysis through disorientation. General Hermann Balk later described fighting Patton as fighting smoke that was everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Even the Soviet Union, despite its own mastery of operational maneuver, studied Patton's March offensive as a premier example of deep penetration. Patton had intuitively understood what Soviet theorists had spent decades developing systematically. At the Nuremberg trials, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel admitted that Patton was the Allied general the Germans feared most because they could never predict where he would strike next. George S. Patton died in December 1945 following a car accident in Germany, never receiving the hero's welcome he had earned on the battlefield. His legacy, however, lived on in the foundational doctrine of the American military, from the Armored Operations Manuals of 1949 to the Air-Land Battle Doctrine of the 1980s. He proved that speed, momentum, and audacity could achieve what firepower alone could not. On that morning in March 1945, Eisenhower had seen the future of warfare in the eyes of a man who refused to follow the rules. Patton's genius was in knowing that the enemy's mind was the ultimate battlefield, and by moving faster than they could think, he forced them to defeat themselves. He remains the only man in history who could truly make the impossible routine. If you were in Eisenhower's position, would you have disciplined Patton for his insubordination, or did his results justify his total disregard for the chain of command? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.